Now, we've been through the Civil War, we've been through the Restoration, and that more or less takes us historically through the 17th century. The last classes that we're going to have, we're probably going to have to cancel one of them. I think I said that before because of the Sotsurong that my department does. And so there may only be 2 more classes. The last class, of course, we'll have a test like we had in the middle, and it'll be on the 17th century. So that leaves one major presentation and then a smaller presentation. I think it might be interesting for you to know something about the history of women during the period. And I think it would be interesting to do something on my own specialism, which is to do with ideas about suffering in those days. That's one of the big things that makes these early modern people different from us. They thought you had to suffer, whereas we know better. Well, we think we know better. In our society, people avoid pain and suffering. In their society, that was something you had to go through if you wanted to go to heaven. And so it's one of the things that I researched and thought you might be interested in looking at some of that. So we'll see what we can do for the rest of the course in terms of looking at some of the more specialized areas or a slightly different way of looking at the topic. Now, just as England had changed very much at the end of the 16th century, when we look back, it was a fairly unimportant country on the edge of Europe that had it had got a king who just chopped people's heads off whenever he wanted and that sort of thing. By the end of the century, we had Queen Elizabeth taking a fairly humane kind of attitude compared to her father, taking a fairly humane kind of attitude towards her position as queen. And we had the Spanish Armada. So the country was moving towards becoming ever more powerful in Europe. By the end of the 18th century, we've had a king who's actually had his head chopped off. We had another king who was forced to run away in the Glorious Revolution that we looked at last week. And society is moving on yet another step. We're getting more and more towards the kind of society that we would recognize today. The last Stuarts, because we had seen how when Queen Elizabeth died, she left no children, and her nearest relative was James of Scotland. And then it went through his son, his grandsons, and then the second grandson was forced to run away in the Glorious Revolution. And if you remember the story, he had had a first marriage where he had 2 daughters, and a second marriage where he had a son. Now, after he escaped to France, after the Glorious Revolution, the country was ruled by his Protestant daughter, Mary, from his first marriage, and her husband, William of Orange. Orange is an area of what's now southern France. And then when Mary died, her sister Anne took the throne. So these were the last Stuarts. And she also died in 1714. When she died, she had had 5 stillborn children, 5 who died at an early age, and 7 miscarriages. To give you some idea of the risks of being a mother in those days. She became pregnant 17 times, and none of them, not a single one of them, survived. Pretty shocking, isn't it? 17 children, well, so seven that didn't make it to birth, 5 that were born dead, and 5 that died very young. And that was the end of the Stuart line as such. Now, of course, that still left James's, remember, James had his 2 marriages. Okay, James II had his wife number 1 and had those 2, okay, Mary and Anne, 2 daughters, and wife number 2 and had the son James, and then after James, Charles. Like I said, they didn't have much imagination, these Stuarts. Everybody was either James or Charles among the boys. And so there's a little bit of a story about these two. Remember, this side was Catholic on James and Charles's side, and this side, Mary and Anne, was Protestant. And of course, the country supported the Protestant side. Now, James is also known as the Old Pretender. And even for native English speakers, that seems a bit of a strange name. Nanno mane shiteta deshou ka? Okay, it doesn't mean pretend in that sense. It means, an older meaning of pretend is to try. He was trying. So, nani wo shite mite ita deshou ka? Well, in that case, he was trying to be king. He was trying to be king. He was the pretender. And his son, the young pretender. So this is something that's going on into the 18th century, the attempt to get those people, first the father, James, and then the son, Charles, to be the king. And so there were rebellions in the 18th century, 1714 and 1745. It was 1714 or 1750, maybe 1715. I think it's 1715 and 1745. There were rebellions, and they were called the Jacobite rebellions because Jacobus is the Latin name for James. So Jacobite just means James in Latin. Even though in the second one it's not even James, it's Charles, but we still call it the two Jacobite rebellions. So they wanted this side of the family to take control. And they failed, of course. So basically that was the end of the Stuarts. And then after Anne's death, George of Hanover in Germany became king. And if you remember way back, there was a marriage of James the First's. James the First married off his. He wanted to marry his son to the Spanish princess, and that failed. She didn't like him, and he married his daughter to a German prince, basically. And so that side of the family came in and took control, took the position of king. The 18th century is going to be very different. A lot of the time when we're talking about the 16th and 17th century, I spent quite a lot of time talking about who is king and queen. When they get to the 18th century, they don't really talk about that very much. Because the king is no longer really so important. The king or the queen is becoming more like today, a figurehead. something to put on the money, somebody to cut the ribbon at big ceremonies, somebody to make speeches, but not an important person in the politics of the country. And one of the reasons in the case of England, the King, George, couldn't speak English. So this is a great time for the politicians. They can get in there and do things. The King doesn't speak English, and he's not even interested in England. Right? He's interested in his lands over in Germany. So this is a chance for politics to develop in the 18th century. The power of kings had been conclusively limited by the Glorious Revolution. They started off cutting the king's head, chopping the king's head off, but then the king was brought back again, and then they kicked out a king that was unpopular. So they showed very strongly that they didn't have to accept the politician. The politicians didn't have to accept the king if they didn't want to. Kings and queens had to cooperate with the people and with the parliament. And that's been the situation ever since. So politically, things are looking a little bit more like modern times. And then we get the King, George I, not very interested in Britain, didn't even speak English. And this is more of an opportunity for Parliament to develop its powers. So the 18th century is going to be a time of political development. We get the first, in the 18th century is when you get the first prime ministers, Sori-Daijin. You get the idea of a political cabinet, a group of special ministers who have a particular power, authority for particular areas. So it's beginning to look more like modern politics. Okay. Let's have a look and see what England now looks like in its international context at the end of the 17th century. Of course, Wales had been under the control of England for so long that when they said England, they usually meant England and Wales. So Wales had become kind of assimilated into England. I said from the time of Henry VIII, but sono mai demo, even before Henry VIII, Wales was under English control. The reason I put Henry VIII is because our story in our class began then. But yoku kangaetara, sono mai demo, even before that, Wales was under English control. And of course, we talked about the fact that the Tudor monarchs came from a Welsh family, and that helped things. And Scotland and England became closer because the Stuarts were of Scottish origin. It wasn't until 1707 that the two countries, Scotland and England, were united. Once they were formally united, this is when we start talking about the United Kingdom. And this is when we really, in history, we should stop talking about England and really we should be talking about Britain. Because Seiji Tekini, it's Britain now. It's a united kingdom of England, Scotland and Wales. Ireland didn't join until the early 19th century. But basically, you've got a united kingdom. These three countries are united. What's the difference between formally uniting and just having two countries with the same king? The Parliament, the government. There was a Scottish Parliament separately. There was a Scottish government separately up until 1707. Right? After that, there was no Scottish Parliament. In the last 20 years or so, something like that. In the last 20 or so, 20, 25 years, there's been a Scottish Parliament again. All right. It has limited powers. It can't decide to make war, for example. but it can decide things like the taxation levels inside the country, the educational policy inside the country and things like that. So once again, Scotland has a limited form of parliament now. And as you know, 3 or 4 years ago, they voted for, they had a choice of independence, and they did not choose at that stage to become independent. But whether this United Kingdom will stay united in the future is a big open question, especially because Britain, the United Kingdom, now wants to leave Europe. Scotland did not want to leave. So Scotland may say, well, thank you, bye-bye. 300年間ありがとうございます。分けましょう. Okay? They may say, let's separate now because we don't want to leave Europe. So we don't know what's going to happen there. So there was this Act of Union in 1707. Scotland, England, the Act of Union with Scotland brought England, Scotland and Wales together as the Kingdom of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom. And then Ireland didn't formally unite until 1801. I've talked about Ireland a bit and its difficult position. It had a much more unhappy relationship with England than Wales and Scotland. And believe me, quite a lot of Welsh people don't like the English very much. And quite a lot of Scottish people are not very happy. Okay? It's unusual for people to be personally unfriendly, I mean, especially to a nice guy like me. I mean, when I went to Wales, I met many very lovely people, and in Scotland too, lots of very nice people, but they're not very happy about the relationship with England. Even today, it's still a question, but Ireland's relationship was much worse. Oliver Cromwell was particularly cruel when he took power. You remember that there was a little bit of a problem going on in Ireland under Charles I, and that problem was still there when Oliver Cromwell took power. He was especially cruel in suppressing rebellion in Ireland and importing or exporting from England and Scotland Protestants to take control, and Irish people went through the 18th century. They were treated they were treated almost as badly as animals, to be honest. They were given almost no rights at all in their own country. So the 18th century for the Irish was probably the worst century that they had. Now, that Ireland is also where James I went after the Glorious Revolution. That's where he tried to get Catholic support for an attempt to win back his crown. And then later on, his son and his grandson also tried to win the crown. And the husband of Mary fought a war in Ireland for 3 years against the Jacobites, against these supporters of James II. So Ireland was now strongly connected with James and the Jacobites, strongly connected with fighting against the ruling monarch. Ireland was being repressed more and more because it was seen as being against the English, which mostly it was. I mean, the religion was different. They were being mistreated by the English. They were against the English, of course they were. And so this war, called the Williamite War, okay, Mary's husband, William, of Orange. He basically took responsibility for that war, and it's called the Williamite War. And he didn't just kind of break the movement to bring James back as King of England. He reduced the Catholic people to the status of second-class citizens. And Ireland is going to be dominated by Protestants. It's going to be a Catholic country where Protestants have the power. So this war, the Williamite War, things are already moving in that direction, but that's the final deciding factor. The Williamite War makes sure that Ireland is going to suffer and is going to be controlled by Protestants. The Catholic population will be controlled by Protestants. Look at Ireland. This policy of encouraging British Protestants to separate in Ireland began right back at the early days of the Reformation. Henry VIII had this idea, and it carried on all through Tudor times and Stuart times. Some of the settlers were English, but a lot of them, especially in the north of Ireland, were Protestants. And the Catholics were finding themselves more and more under the control of the Protestants. So, for example, in our century, in the 17th century, we have the first step is that the Catholics are not allowed to take public office. They're not allowed to do public jobs like shiakusho or, any of those kinds of public seijika toka. They're not allowed to hold public office. They're not even allowed to go into the army in the normal sense, although armies were raised of Catholics. They had to attend Eikoku Kyokai no Misa, Church of England services. Yes, they were still allowed to be members of the House of Commons until 1652, but even then, after that, even that concession was lost, and they were not allowed to be politicians at all. So remember, Ireland is a separate country at this time. Ireland has its own government. Inside the Irish government, no Irish people are allowed after 1652, unless they become Protestants. So the government of Ireland is entirely Protestants who have come from England. Well, their parents, their grandparents have come from England or Scotland or Wales. Okay, does that make sense? The Irish people had no right to be in the parliament of their own country, basically. Unless, as I say, they changed and said, okay, I'm not a Catholic anymore, which was very unusual. The pressure to stay as a Catholic in Irish society was very strong. Now, a lot of those laws were relaxed at the time of the Restoration, and things were looking a little bit better for Ireland. But after this Williamite War, things got even worse. And we get a century of the 18th century is going to be a terrible, terrible time for the Irish, where, as I say, they're going to be treated more or less like animals in their own country. They may not marry Protestants. They're not allowed to have a good horse. They can't teach. They can't run a school. They can't buy land. They can't have guns. They can't vote. They can't. Protestants may not become Catholic. Catholics cannot inherit land, Protestant land. Catholics can't practice law. Catholics are not allowed to go abroad to be educated. These are some of the restrictions that were placed on Catholics. To say that you couldn't own a horse,
costing more than £5, a good horse could cost £500. Okay? You could only have a really bad horse if you were Irish. You could not have anything that we even began to look like a good horse. You had to be kept down. A horse was a status symbol. Irish people could not have status. They were being pushed down to the bottom of the society. And these laws were in force from the end of the Williamite War in 1691. For 110 years, there was this period called the Protestant Ascendancy. It ends in 1801 when Ireland joins the United Kingdom, but it's not, even then there's still Sabbats, there's still discrimination. And then there were many, many Irish Catholics who were shipped to America and the Caribbean. Some historians say they were doré, they were slaves. Others say no, they were indentured servants, which is like one step up. Okay. What today we would say wage slave. You have to work for the company, you have to buy your food from the company, you have to rent your house from the company, you have to give your passport to the company. Okay, I mean, there are people in Japan and in Britain who are working in those kinds of conditions, even today. They are, I mean, it's happening all around the world. There are still lots of people who are just one step up from slaves. Okay, and it's going on, you know, it's going on in civilized countries. It's still a social problem. So the Irish, some historians say they were sent as slaves, like the Africans, to America. Others say, well, actually, they were just a little bit up the scale from slaves. They had some freedoms, but not many. And there was discrimination even after the country became part of the United Kingdom in 1801. And just to bring that kind of message home, last week I was talking about the British Commonwealth. Do you remember those 50, well, it's 53, it might be 52 of them, I'm not sure, 52, 53, 54. The number changes a little bit because countries come in and out occasionally. But these countries used to be part of the British Empire, and Ireland is not even a member of the Commonwealth. It dropped out of the Commonwealth in the 1930s and left it completely in 1949. So India, many countries of Africa, many countries around the world still keep that connection with Britain, but Ireland said, no thank you, more thanks, Sam, we've had enough. So Ireland was perhaps ichiban gyakutai sarete ita kuri deshita, shokuminchi no jidai. Is perhaps the most badly treated. I won't go on and talk about Jukyu Seiki no Rikishi because it's getting much later than our period, but Jukyu Seiki no Nakade, there was a famine, shortage of food. Something like 3 million Irish people either died or left Ireland at that time. And the British government did almost nothing. The population of Ireland, even today, is still lower than before that potato famine. Potato, because the Irish people were only eating potato mostly. They were very poor. So just like in Japan, they would say asa gohan, hiru gohan, ban gohan. They had asa potato, hiru ban potato. Okay? No, seriously, I mean, yeah, go.
Why didn't they just convert to Protestant?
Why didn't they just convert to being Protestants? Well, it's interesting, you know, like, heck, I don't know. Okay, I mean, I think the social pressure, it was like you were a total traitor if you, as an Irish Catholic, became a Protestant. I think local people might have killed you. I mean, the pressure to be Catholic is very, very strong. And the pressure inside Catholic countries to, even today, to follow Catholic teaching is very strong. The society is held together by its Catholic morality. I lived in Spain for a long time, and the Spanish people, they're quite free, you know, in lots of ways, but you have to respect certain things. For example, in my society, in English society, it's quite typical for people to live together but not to marry. And they might marry later on, you know, after 10 years, or when the children start to grow up and they think, yeah, buddy, we're never going to break up, so we'll get married now. So it's quite common to have a marriage with, you know, 2 or 3 children around. Okay? When I told that to my Spanish friends, they go, oh, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. The society is held together by a Catholic morality. If you try to break with it, you lose all your friends. You lose your community. You lose your family. Even in my family history, my grandmother was Irish. She grew up with no family except for her parents, because her father was training to be a priest in Ireland, and he fell in love with a girl in the village. Just before he was supposed to become a priest, he ran away with her. Both families never spoke to them ever again. So my grandmother grew up with no other family, just her mother and father, because both families never contacted again. That's how strong the pressure is. If you're in that society, you are in it. If you break with it, you're completely out. And so I think that's the one big answer. I mean, I could also say, well, people believed the Catholic Church. They believed they would go to hell if they didn't stay with the Catholic Church. That might be part of it. But I think another very big part of it is social pressure. Okay? So I agree, you know, they could have made their lives easier by becoming Protestants, but it would be easier in one way with the English. It would be much harder in another way with their community. All right? Now, in relation to other countries around the world, there were several wars going on in the late 17th century in Europe. The Anglo-Dutch wars, the wars between England and Holland from 1652 to 1674, 3 times war broke out with Holland. And if you were to become interested in the 18th century, the fighting of the 18th century was all like this, nearly all of it, to control the trade routes, to control the markets. These wars with Holland are typical of the way the British Empire grew up. The Shokuminchi Jidai, for Britain, the whole British Empire was based on markets, trade. Japan, of course, at this time was Sakoku, and it wasn't until the early 20th century that Japan started having kind of ideas of an empire and building up and taking, but it was much more of a military operation in the case of Japan. And perhaps for that reason, it grew up very quickly and it ended very quickly. Britain was concerned with markets. Okay, you know, it's like, you know, da-dum, da-dum. We're the British. We're here. We want you to sell us your stuff. We want you to buy our stuff. And we're going to make you do it. Okay? One of the worst things that they did in the 19th century was opium hacking. You've heard of Akin Senso. They said, they went into China and said, you have to buy our Indian opium. China said, well, actually, we're not really interested in being drug addicts. But Britain said, you know, you have to. So Britain was forcing people, Britain was buying and selling slaves, Britain was buying and selling opium. They just wanted to buy and sell stuff and make money. That's what the British Empire was always about. It was about markets. Of course, some of the markets were not quite so unpleasant as that. Coffee, tea, sugar, tobacco, cotton. Cotton was a big one for shirts and clothing. But that's what these wars were about, trading routes. At that time, England was not successful. It's going to be in the 18th century that Britain starts to be successful. Holland actually won control of the major trading routes, but then in the first half of the 18th century, this is when Britain is going to win its empire. It's going to fight almost non-stop for 50 years. And it's fighting other European countries to control places like India, Jamaica, different countries around the world. The French were in India before the British were. The Spanish were in Jamaica before the British were. So Britain is fighting to push the French out and say, we want that one. Push the Spanish out and say, we want that one. And pushing out other countries, other European countries. So basically, if it hadn't been the British, it would have been somebody. It happened that India became British, but the French were there first. And if Britain hadn't taken control, everybody in India would be speaking French today instead of English. Okay. In Jamaica, they could still be speaking Spanish. Right? So it just, Britain went and fought other countries to win control of colonies that various European countries were competing for at that time. And so there were all these wars going on, a lot of them against France, but also other European countries. And yeah, the basic thing was to control colonies, to control trading routes. So by the middle of the 18th century, England, or we should say Britain really, because they're now a united country, Britain has got the best of its European rivals, and it's controlling an empire. So our period, the Juroku Junana Seiki, 16th and 17th century, is not the height of the British Empire, but we're seeing the beginnings of the British Empire. So I think it might be useful for us to sort of follow that process a little bit and see how it works. Sorekara. When we talk about the start of the Tudor period, when Henry VII came into power, you look at, for example, this is 1492, that's the year that Columbus discovered America. What is this little country in red? Okay, it's just England, there's Wales, and there's a little bit of Ireland. It's a fairly small, fairly unimportant country at the end of the 15th century. Move on a little bit to 1660, and it controls the whole island, both islands, because although Ireland is not technically united with Britain, it is basically under British control. So all of the British Isles are under English control, essentially, and you've got these Shokuminchi, look at them, India, 2 areas of Africa, South America, lots of little islands, kono chisana shima, Karibu no shima tokuni, lots of those little islands, the colonies in North America, what are now the United States and Canada. So in in the middle of the 17th century, you've got suddenly a very international country here, with colonies stretching all around the world. If you look 100 years later, そんなに変わってないみたいけど、ちょっと増えた. Okay, if you look, you can see that. If you look carefully, you can see it grows a little bit over that period. Can you see from there to there? But it's not so much that the colonies grow. What's really changed over this 100-year period is the infrastructure. These places are now stable communities with huge production. And it's always a little bit difficult showing the British Empire, because the most important part of the British Empire is not the big areas of land, but the little islands. British ships can go anywhere in the world because doko itemo, there's a little island that's British. So they can get fresh fruit, they can get fresh water, they can get fresh supplies. Sekai no doko itemo. There's always a little island that belongs to Britain. One of the most famous Victorian songs about the British Empire is "Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves." Britain's empire was made through control of the sea. Okay? So between the middle of the 17th century and the middle of the 18th century, the territory, the land, the infrastructure, the land is not grown, it's grown a bit, it's bigger, but it's not like hugely bigger. What's really important is the infrastructure and the control of these little islands all over the place that give Britain the possibility of developing its empire even more. And then, okay, we see the explosion of land. Huh? What are we seeing? What's going on? Sorry. Yeah, now we see, in the end, it grows like this. By the early 20th century, okay, we've got India, Australia, many parts of Africa, Canada. The only loss, of course, is the United States. 独立になりました、18世紀の真ん中ぐらい, a little bit later than the middle of the century, but they became independent. But this is what it became at its height. And our 17th century is really the beginnings of all of that. And now today, of course, moto ni modotta mitai. Okay, it seems like we're back to just being a little unimportant country that thinks it's very important. Okay, they think they're very important, but it's basically just a very little country on the edge of Europe. Scotland nearly became independent a few years ago. We don't know what the future is, and it seems like everything's gone back to the beginning, but not quite. Not quite. Yes, most of Ireland is independent. Yes, Scotland nearly became independent, could have become independent in 2014. There's just a few remote islands and over. So around the world, these places are still British. These places are still left over from the empire. Okay? You'll notice this one off the coast of South America. Margaret Thatcher fought a war over those, the Falkland Islands. She fought a war against Argentina to keep those islands. So they still have some important areas inside Spain. They have Gibraltar, okay, at the south of Spain. They've got these little kind of British hotspots still around the world. This is what's left of the British Empire. But the other shadow of the British Empire, as I said last week, is the Commonwealth of Nations. Okay, this is the Commonwealth of Nations. If you compare it to the Empire, that's the Empire. Okay, that's the Commonwealth of Nations. Okay. Yeah. All right. Most of the countries, many of the countries that were part of the Empire are part of this Commonwealth of Nations, which continues to have economic, cultural, various kinds of contacts with Britain. So it's basically like when the Empire ended, and do you know why it ended? Same reason it began, money. After World War II, Britain was a poor country. It could not keep up the infrastructure of India and all these different countries around the world. Africa. It just had to say, okay, guys, look, you've been saying you want your own country. You want your country back. And you're getting a bit angry as well. I can see some of you throwing spears, and so I'll just bye. It's your country. You want it. You've got it. I mean, you're still going to buy. We still want to buy your bananas. Do you still want to buy our clothes? Okay, they kept that economic relationship going as much as possible. All right, so that's how the empire ended. But that's 20th century history, so I'm jumping a long way forwards here. But I thought you might want to see the kind of complete picture, the process. So that's the empire. Let's go back to our, 18th, beginning of the 18th century, end of the 17th century. Let's just take a We've moved away from the religious way of looking at the world, basically. At the beginning of the 17th century, it was still normal to look at the world in a religious kind of way of thinking. Shukyo no kangai kata. Okay, you're here in this world, and koko no sekai no jinken toka, fair ka douka, kankei nai. What matters is, are you going to go to heaven after you die, or are you going to go to hell? If you're gyakutai sareta in this world, if you're mistreated in this world, that doesn't matter. Why do we care about that? What matters is the next world. That way of thinking, by the end of the 17th century, 絶対消えたと言えないけど、珍しくなってました. It was becoming unusual for people to think like that. So it started off as a place, the way of thinking was that this planet is a place where you just exist in order to get your place in heaven after you die. I think the Puritans really helped to change that way of thinking, because the Puritans really were very strict about religion. And I think by the end of the Puritan period, most people were thinking, "Mo takusan, can't we just relax a bit and enjoy our life, So the idea that it's okay to enjoy your life had become much more normal. What we call the pleasure principle. You don't have to suffer, you don't have to keep on suffering. The pleasure principle was more widely accepted. And all sorts of things were changing. Belief in witchcraft. Okay, remember, in the earlier part of the 17th century, women were still being burned as witches. Well, it continued all through the 17th century. But Belief in witches is starting to go down. In the earlier part of the 18th century, they make a new law about witches. The new law about witches is, if you accuse somebody of being a witch, we will punish you. Because witches don't exist. Got it? All right? They finally woke up to kind of something like our way of looking at the world. Instead of having a magical view of the world where there are witches going around doing magic, no, they said the crime is not to be a witch. The crime is to say that somebody is a witch, because there are no witches. So even if you say that you are, if you say that you are a witch, okay, I can do magic. We will punish you too, because you're saying that you're a witch, and there are no witches. So if you say that another person is a witch, or you say that you yourself are a witch, well, we'll punish you for that, because there are no witches.
I wonder why people accuse someone of being a witch.
Why did they accuse someone of being a witch?
So, like, what makes you a witch?
Sometimes it would just be ijiwaru, just to be nasty to someone. Sometimes it would be real fear. And if people really believe in witches, it's hard to understand. Japan hasn't had, for example, like a civil war where Japanese are fighting Japanese. Not while it was a united country. I mean, when Japan was divided into smaller countries, there were smaller countries fighting against each other. Am I right about? I'm not too good on my Japanese history, but you know, I lived in Spain and they had a civil war, and they really, you know, made enemies of each other. And you couldn't just not, you couldn't stay out. Everybody had to be involved. If you said, I'm not, both sides would attack you. These kinds of things where a society sort of has a strong belief. And if it's like, my cow is sick, your cow's sick, my cow's sick too. Yeah. Your cows are sick, my cows are sick too. What's going on here? I don't know. Something's going on in the village. Something's wrong. What's happening? Our cows are all dying. What are we going to do? It's that old lady who lives out on the hill there by herself. She's got a cat. I'll bet she's a witch. I've seen her at night. I've seen her going around at night time. I've seen her walking around saying strange things. She talks, you know, she's walking around going, blah, 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 blah. She's talking, I think she's talking to the devil. Can you see how the stories grow up? And people start thinking, if we kill the old woman, the cows will get healthy again. And it is very difficult to understand, isn't it? But the idea that if you blame somebody and that you punish them, that everything else will be okay. It goes back a long way. It's in the Bible even, you know. They used to take a goat. When the village was having trouble in the Bible, they'd take a goat and they would throw stones at the goat until it was dead. And then they would all go away thinking, well, everything will be okay now. The poor goat's not done anything. Okay, we still have that word in English, scapegoating, to scapegoat. Okay, choose a victim, make that victim pay, and then everybody else feels better and they think they've solved the problem. They haven't really done anything, okay, but they feel better because they've done something horrible. So,
I got the idea.
Humans are horrible. Well, the first thing you have to understand, humans are not very nice sometimes, okay, and so they did these terrible things. So yeah. All right then. Then we got, towards the end of our 17th century period, we got something called the Bill of Rights. This was like the first time, really, that something had come into law saying that we human beings have rights, we have kingri. Before that, you don't have any kingri. You just go through the world. If somebody chops off your hand, well, you lost your hand. If somebody takes your eyes out, well, you lost your eyes. If somebody kills your children, well, you lost your children. You don't have any kingly in this world. Okay? There were no idea about such a thing. But the Bill of Rights said that Parliament has to be held frequently. Taxes can only be made by Parliament, not by the King or anyone else. In Parliament, there's freedom of speech. Laws may not be suspended without the agreement of the Parliament. You have to have free elections, no cruel and unusual punishments, no armies in peacetime. And Protestants, not Catholics, but Protestants can carry guns. They can bear arms. Now that was a landmark piece of legislation. But these are rights. These are rights in our society. And the idea that there are kingly, there are rights, was first expressed really at that time. And it's a really important piece of legislation, a really important document, because it's echoed in the basic laws of England, the fundamental laws of England. It's echoed in the American Declaration of Independence, all right, cruel and unusual punishment, the right to bear arms, those sorts of things. It's echoed in the American Bill of Rights. It's echoed in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's echoed in the United Nations Kokuren Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's echoed in the European Convention of Human Rights. All of these very, very important documents of rights have their great-great-granddaddy in the legislation of 1689. So this is where the idea of Jinking comes into Western thinking, really. Okay, before the American Independence Declaration, before the French Revolution, the idea of human rights has its beginnings here in 17th century England. So we are moving now into a more urban society. Urban just means connected with the town or the city. Britain is going to be, England in particular, is going to be the first country in the world, the first major country in the world where there are going to be more people living in the city. Is it a bit too bright, yeah? More people living in the city than living in the countryside. So there are huge changes going on in the kind of society that we've got in Britain. And that's moving forward through things like, hello? Huh? What's going on? What's going on? Anika. Okay, all right. Okay. The first newspaper printed in 1620, and it was actually printed in Holland and shipped into England because there was quite strong censorship in England at that time. The censorship was largely for religious reasons, but at that time, Britain was a fairly strict country, stricter than quite a lot of other parts of Europe. So the first newspaper, the first English newspaper, was actually printed in Holland and brought into England by ship. 1650, you get the first coffee shop, which opened in Oxford, actually, rather than in London. A couple of years later, there was a coffee shop opened up in London. And by the end of the 17th century, you've got hundreds of coffee shops all over the place. Newspapers and coffee houses quite often went together. The customers would, just like they do today, they'd take the newspaper and go and read it in the coffee house. Now, the difference is that today in our big cities, people wouldn't usually be talking about what they read in the newspaper. They might take the newspaper and get a cup of coffee and sit there and read the newspaper, or there might be a television on. They don't tend to talk too much to each other about it. That's true, certainly true in a big city like Tokyo. London, it would be true. Yeah, most of the places I've been to in the world, people wouldn't really talk too much about it. But in those days, communities were smaller, and it was a new thing to be going to coffee shops and things. People would talk to each other about these topics. So the coffee houses became a kind of center for exchanging ideas and information. The censorship of the earlier part of the 17th century was relaxed in the 1640s, and you get large numbers of political pamphlets, news broadsheets, and they're all kind of telling different... I should have turned off my mail program. They're all telling different points of view about politics and things that are going on in the world. And of course, this is the time of Cromwell's civil war. So this is the first kind of big political situation where print plays a big part in what happens. Before that, we saw how people would stand up in St. Paul's churchyard and they would speak, and other people would hear what they said, and they would go and tell their friends, and they would spread things around in that way. Now you're getting it through print. It can reach anybody who can get to the shop and buy it. It can reach lots and lots of people at the same sort of time. We get the London Gazette is the first official newspaper that belongs to the Crown. Well, it is the official newspaper. It started up in the 1660s. And so you've got this kind of society growing up, so that by the end of the century, by 1700, there are about 3,000 coffee shops in London alone, and dozens of news-carrying pamphlets, broadsheets, gazettes, most of which were published several times a week. And then just after that, in 1702, you get the first daily newspaper. So the idea of going and sitting in a coffee shop and reading the newspaper didn't exist 100 years before. There were no newspapers and there were no coffee shops. And you've gone from a society where people's lives focused on the church to a society where people's lives focus on their social interactions. They're focusing on the coffee shop and the people they're going to meet there, the things that are written in the newspaper. Before that, it was the church and the Bible. 100 years before, even, at the end of the 16th century, it would all be about the church and the Bible, basically. 100 years later, it's about the coffee shop and the newspaper. Which of those two worlds is more like our world? Well, the world of the coffee shop and the newspaper is our world, isn't it, really? More or less, still. Yeah, much closer. If I said, compared with the church and the Bible, you'd say, well, kita koto arimasu kedo. It's not really very much part of my world. Keikensha de wa nai. So it's becoming more like the world that we know, that we recognize. Some of the famous coffee houses were Lloyd's. Now, there's still a big insurance company called Lloyd's, a big banking business called Lloyd's. It's still there. The big insurance companies and banking companies. How did they happen? People went to the coffee shop and people said, "この経済の問題ね、何か。そうですね。私はもっといい考えができます。What's your idea? Yeah, go on, tell me. Oh, I think this. And yeah, me too. And hey, let's do something. And because there was nothing, they would start it. They would say, let's have a system for lending people money so they can get their business going. Or let's have a system for, we'll all pay together for a big ship to go to America and bring back lots of stuff to make us rich. Or let's get together and make a kind of, and they would do it in the coffee shops. So the coffee shops were kind of like the springboard for moving forward into something like our modern world. The banking system, the insurance system, and the stock exchange began in a coffee shop called Jonathan's. Well, I don't know if it's the same Jonathan's that you have here, but anyway, there was a Jonathan's in London in the 17th century, and it was the beginnings of the stock exchange, the Kabu. Doctors' surgeries. Can you imagine people would go to the coffee shop and say, okay, and from that it would develop into a medical kind of practice. Okay, so many things have their beginnings in the coffee shop. Scientists at the Grecian coffee shop, all right, and writers at Will's. People would get together and they would make a kind of social club of the people who were similar to them. And so all these coffee shops, you've got thousands of them, okay, 3,000 just in London alone. And they're not all kind of going to begin new companies or be the beginnings of a new kind of type of society, but many of them are. So that the coffee shop is actually a hugely important place for changing the face of the society. This would be a typical coffee shop from those days. The long hair is katsura, it's a wig. Okay, high-class people wore wigs. I don't know why. Okay, I don't know why they wore wigs. Okay, just don't get it. But it was a fashion. And you got Christie's and Sotheby's setting up their auction companies. You got Twinings selling tea and chocolate. Fortnum and Mason in the grocery business. All of those companies are still running. Some of the big companies that have sort of make, they're kind of atarimae for us now. Oh yes, I went to London. I got this wonderful Fortnum and Mason, omiyage for you. Dozo. Chocolate, tea, Twinings tea. Who hasn't? You must have drunk Twinings tea, yeah? No, you don't know that company. Twinings. They make Earl Grey and things like that. If you go to Heathrow Airport and you buy getting duty free, okay, big area for all of these things, Twinings, Fortnum and Mason. So the face of modern Britain is beginning to take shape here. Okay, you're beginning to have banking systems, auction houses, Kabu, stock exchange, companies, that we still have today. And technology also is moving much closer towards our modern world. Francis Bacon actually dates from the Elizabethan period, from the 16th century. He's often considered the father of modern science, and he developed the scientific way of thinking. But he was just one person in the Elizabethan period. By the middle of the 17th century, you've got a whole society. And by the end of the 17th century, it's changing the face of the country. So the scientific way of thinking. You've got doctors, physicians, William Gilbert, William Harvey, developing the understanding of the human body and how the human body works. They had a completely strange idea about the way the body works in the 16th and 17th century. They didn't even, these things, some of the things that are atarimae for us, like, germs cause illness, they didn't have that idea. Okay? Queen Elizabeth, I think, used to wash herself once a year. Okay? I'm not even sure if she washed herself very carefully then. All right? They didn't think that it was necessary to being clean wasn't something that they really thought about. Okay? They didn't make the connection between being clean and getting illnesses. Then you've got chemistry. the Royal Society, the Royal Observatory. Britain was one of the leaders in the race to map the skies, the stars, to understand the position of the stars, the movements of the stars, the different planets that are going around the sun. Britain was a leader in that area. And then the laws of motion. Isaac Newton discovered Inryoku, the idea of Inryoku. Before that, nobody knew why, you know, if you drop something, it falls. But nobody ever thought about why. Okay? Here's the first scientist to sort of come up with an explanation for why that happens. So to predict what would happen if you were on the moon then? Would it still, or would it fall down to the earth? What would happen? Okay, and think about it in relation to the other planets and other environments. If you drop this and if you drop this tiny little piece of paper and this, which one hits the ground first? It's the same. Okay. See, people hadn't even thought to ask the question before. But it's the same. All right. 32 feet per second was what I learned at school. It gets faster as it keeps going. So there's a mathematical principle that came from it, and again, that sort of thing was being developed. And this starts to be called the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, and because it's based on science and practical matters, that's what opens the door to Sagyo Kakume, the Industrial Revolution, later on in the 18th century. So again, all of that has its kind of important period of development in the 17th century.